Hey folks, Sean Jordan from RPG here. It's Donate Life Month and a lot of folks are busy, so I don't have an interview lined up for this week. But I have something just as good for you, and it comes from my friend and colleague Cecil Puvathingal, who I met last year when I was looking for a new survey platform. He has a background in healthcare as well as in sales, and by the way, he prefers Cecil. Just Cecil, like Prince. Now, Cecil currently works for Question Pro, and last year I needed to make a change and I was looking at 9 different survey platforms, and eventually I narrowed my choices down to 2, and Cecil helped me narrow things further down to 1, Question Pro. And he did it by being an amazing listener. Now look, I have worked in sales. I even won awards for being good at sales, and game recognizes game, right? I know that when Cecil and I met, it was in a context where his job was to help me decide to go with his service. And he made the decision easy, and that's why he's good at his job. But here's what you don't know. Cecil's been battling with ALS and gradually losing his mobility. In just the time between when I first met him and when I had a chance to hear from him 6 months later, he went through some serious medical issues. He's also a new father, and he is fighting like you would not believe to be able to hold his daughter on his terms and to be the best father and husband he can be. On his LinkedIn profile, he says it simply. Every day is like Christmas to him. I admire his optimism, his drive, his desire to make the most out of every chance he gets. But it's also not easy for him to be a guest on a podcast. So you'll forgive me for doing things a little differently today, because what I'm going to do is share some of Cecil's wisdom from one of his recently written pieces and also a few clips from a video he recently posted about the importance of listening. You'll get to hear his voice and learn from him directly. And what Cecil has to say is relevant to everyone in the OPO space, because his technique for being good at what he does is vital for dealing with anyone who's frustrated, who's looking for clear answers amidst a lot of chaos and confusion, who's struggling with the demands of enormous responsibilities while trying to make tough decisions, and who needs help but may be afraid to ask for it. And again, it's listening. But as I've talked about in articles on OPO Insights, including one linked in the show notes, listening is not just hearing other people speak and waiting for your turn to talk. It's an essential skill where you actually have to process what's being said by the other party and let it guide how you respond. Cecil is so good at it, and we all can be too. So let me start by sharing this piece Cecil posted up last week called Listening That Wins. It's part 3 in a series he's been doing, and it starts like this. Last week, I was hospitalized. A hospital room is a way of making everything honest. There's no agenda, no performance, no room to pretend. And in that stripped down space, you feel listening, or the absence of it, more acutely than anywhere else I've ever been. Let me share a few moments from the same stay. The first happened in the ER. I was exhausted despite sleeping for days, dehydrated despite guzzling water, hungry despite an upset stomach, and in real pain. I needed to be transferred from my wheelchair to a bed. There were already several people in the room working through how to do it safely. Grace, that's Cecil's wife, was there. She transfers me every single day. She did it throughout her pregnancy, and she still does. She knows how to move me safely. She was ready. Then someone walked in who clearly hadn't read the room. He didn't pause. He didn't take stock of who was already there or what was already in motion. He took over immediately, started calling out directions, and when Grace stepped in to say that there was a safer approach because she knows she lives this every single day, he cut her off. I need you to step back. He wasn't a bad person. He was just absent. He was physically in the room, but not actually present. He hadn't listened to the room before he entered it, and it cost us. I was furious, not because of the logistics, but because in one of the most vulnerable moments a human being can experience, someone decided their way of doing things mattered more than the person who actually knew the answer. I screamed in pain. He left the room, his job completed. That is transactional listening at its worst. Not listening to understand, but moving straight to action before understanding has been earned. That is what it feels like when someone doesn't listen. So I'm going to stop reading there for a moment. The full article is linked in the show notes, and I do hope you will read it. But let's take a moment to unpack what I just shared from Cecil's story. We start off with a scene where the pain points aren't in the abstract, but they are literal moments of pain and frustration caused by an emergent medical need and the difficulty working with a patient who's in great pain. The solution was right there in the room. Cecil's wife knew what to do and what needed to be done, and yet in strode a person who couldn't listen, who was sure he had the right answers and who wound up getting the result everyone wanted, but in the most painful, infuriating way possible. So let's pause and ask, have you ever been in Cecil's shoes, feeling like you're at the mercy of someone who just won't hear what you have to say? Even worse, have you ever been the person who made things even worse with a my way or the highway attitude that got you what you wanted, but at a great cost to everyone else involved? I think we all have. And I want to share another selection from Cecil's article to talk about what it's like to be that guy and why taking a moment to step back and listen is so important. During the pandemic, I had the privilege of leading a team whose work looked nothing like a traditional sales role, and it taught me one of the most important listening lessons of my career. We were placing travel nurses into hospitals overwhelmed by COVID patients. The need was urgent. The stakes were literally life and death, and I had two exceptional nurse managers on my team who started telling me something I needed to stop and truly hear. The nurses reporting to them were struggling, not clinically, but emotionally. They were experiencing an identity crisis. They'd chosen their profession to be at the bedside, to care for patients directly, and here they were, helping other nurses to get those bedsides instead. They were asking themselves hard questions. Are we real nurses? What does it mean to be a nurse when you're no longer at the bedside? Should we be doing this? Does this work even matter? It would have been easy to respond with efficiency, to redirect the conversation towards metrics, placements, and performance, to move quickly past the discomfort. Instead, I listened. Both managers needed me to hear what their teams were actually carrying, not just what was showing up in the numbers. And once I understood the real concern, the response became clear. We showed them the math. We showed them the number of patients who had received care because of the nurses they had placed. One travel nurse placed at a hospital in crisis didn't just help one patient. She helped dozens. The ripple effect was enormous. Their work was multiplying patient care exponentially at the exact moment it was needed most. The math only made sense once we started listening. The identity crisis didn't disappear overnight, but something shifted. The culture started changing when they felt that what they were experiencing had been genuinely heard and responded to with truth rather than deflection. They weren't less of a nurse, they were extending what nursing could do in an impossible moment. That only happened because two managers were willing to listen to their teams, and I was willing to listen to them. Relational listening all the way down. That is why listening is not just a sales skill, it's a leadership skill. It changes what people are willing to say out loud. In business and especially in sales, the listening breakdown I see most often is what I call the timeline trap. One quarter ends, our pipeline has a gap, our manager's asking questions, and so we introduce urgency into conversations where the other person hasn't arrived there yet. We push timelines that belong to us, not to them. And the moment we do that, the other person feels it. Pressure creates resistance. Respect creates confidence, and confidence is what actually moves decisions forward. Wow. There are so many points we can take away just from what I shared there. One of the first is what was mentioned at the end. We have priorities, and they're often related to our own need to make things happen. You know, in the organ procurement world, there's a strict timeline with cases once a family decides to withdraw care. And if you're not willing to follow that timeline, lives can literally be lost because donation and transplantation won't happen. It's important to have a sense of urgency. And yet, it's even more important to listen. And in this example, did you notice what happened? Listening led to an opportunity to share data and let the nurses know the importance of getting travel nurses placed. Sure, the impact is very similar to the number of lives that a single organ donor can save, right? But before that, what needed to be regarded were the feelings of the people involved. The stress, the anxiety, the self-doubt, the identity crisis, the feeling that patients weren't being served by the system because the nurses weren't able to do the very thing they'd felt called to do, to be at the bedside caring for patients. What nurse in her or his right mind would want to have a traveler come in and do the job that she or he signed up for in the first place? Listening opened the door for sharing, and sharing opened the door for minds to be changed and progress to move forward, not in a my way or the highway manner that created pain for one side, but in a collaborative, comfortable, truthful manner that allowed the nurse managers to see things differently and understand that they were now being called to think of themselves as a new kind of team, working in response to an incredible crisis, and to understand that no matter what their role was, they were part of the solution for caring for patients. See? I told you this was good stuff. And now I'm going to let Cecil do his own speaking because he was gracious enough to share a video from which I've taken a few clips. Now, this is a sales training video that Question Pro has put out into the world on their public YouTube page called Most People Don't Listen, They Wait. But it is their property, and I encourage you to check out the show notes for a link to the entire video. And by the way, thank you, Question Pro, for being such a transparent and amazing organization. I'm really proud to be a customer. And this isn't a commercial. They're not paying me to say this, but if you're looking for a survey platform, they are the folks I would recommend without reservation. Here's Cecil.
Over the past year, I've spent a lot of time with my ALS care team, neurologists, pulmonologists, respiratory therapists, physical therapists, nurses, my wife, my family, my friends. Some of those conversations are incredibly hard. When you're sitting in a room talking about your health, your future, and your family, you become very aware of how people listen. Some doctors move quickly to information and solutions. Others slow down. They ask questions. They pause. They make sure they truly understand what you are experiencing. Yeah, the difference is enormous. When someone listens deeply, you feel calmer. You feel respected. You feel like you're not alone in the situation. And that is what listening does. It changes the emotional environment of the conversation. And the same thing happens in business. Listening determines whether that trust deepens or disappears.
I wanted to start with this clip because I know that it's something that will really resonate with OPO professionals, particularly when we talk about doctors who act quickly to find solutions versus those who take the time to listen and think more deeply about the patient's needs. Many people in the medical world are problem solvers who fixate on getting patients well and who sometimes view pain as a temporary solution that can be alleviated with rapid treatment. This is not a bad impulse. But pain is a symptom, not a root problem, and when all a medical practitioner does is alleviate the symptom without first talking to the patient and understanding their need, the patient may continue to feel stress and anxiety and apprehension. The treatment may also only temporarily solve a problem that will be right back when the intervention wears off. Listening helps to calm the patient down, make them feel safe, help them to feel trust, and then to have confidence in the plan of action. Wise words. And I have so much more to share from Cecil.
There are 3 different common types of listening. Transactional listening waits for an opening to speak. Diagnostic listening instead focuses on requirements and solutions. Relational listening goes a step further and much deeper. Relational listening seeks to understand the person behind the problem. Relational listening is where trust forms. Let's dive in a little bit deeper. Transactional listening is driven by urgency. Prospects and customers The other person, they feel it immediately. Even when the sales rep is polite, the conversation begins to feel like a process instead of a partnership. Transactional listening makes people feel managed rather than understood, and trust begins to weaken. Diagnostic listening focuses on understanding the problem. It improves conversations. However, it can still miss something important: the emotional content behind the problem. People are not only solving technical issues, they're navigating pressure and risk. Without relational listening layered on top of it, conversations can still feel very cold. A customer recently evaluated multiple vendors when replacing their survey platform. Two vendors made that final list. Both solutions technically solved the problem. One vendor pushed urgency, they pushed timelines. They tried to move the decision forward quickly. The other vendor instead slowed down. They asked thoughtful questions. They listened carefully and respected the customer's process. The decision was not based on features, it was based on trust. Let me say that again. The decision was not based on features, it was based on trust. By the time the decision happened, the customer already knew who they were comfortable with. Listening had already decided the outcome.
The three types of listening Cecil defines are transactional, diagnostic, and relational. And you might say, well, these types of listening do have a time and a place, Sean. And I could see that argument, but let me agree with Cecil that the third type of listening, relational, is almost always the best choice because it slows things down, builds safety, trust, and confidence, and then allows the decision to move forward. And can I tell you something else? So that situation that he offers as an example there, yeah, I was that customer. And I don't mean that just in kind of a metaphorical sense, like I'm Spartacus. I mean this quite literally. He tells the story in more detail in the actual article, and he asked me if he could use this story about me to illustrate the importance of listening. And you know what? I was, of course, honored that Cecil would even ask me that, but let me provide some context. So, my survey platform is the backbone of all my research work. We use it for everything. It costs us as much as a part-time employee, but it is vital to the work we do as researchers. And yes, we even use our survey platform for our work for OPOs. So, when I decided to leave our previous platform, which had gone from being one of the best companies I'd ever dealt with to one of the worst after they attempted to launch an IPO and go public, I really didn't want to make another choice that was going to lead me down a bad road. I made a list of about 15 vendors. I winnowed it down to 9 that I actually tried out, and then I winnowed it down further to 2. And by the way, there was a third one, but they lost my confidence by being transactional with me because they were more worried about the money that they could make from me than the services that I needed. And so I'd already shut them down before I even spoke to Cecil. Out of the 2 remaining, the platforms were more or less comparable in price and quality. Both had great testimonials from colleagues I knew and trusted, and both were better than the platform I was coming from in terms of meeting my technical needs. I could have gone with either of them, and I was open and honest with both of them that I was considering their competitor as well. So Cecil told the story about the one who failed to earn my business and what they did, but let me tell you what he and his team did. So I met with one of his newer sales reps, and she was nice, but not particularly knowledgeable because she was still learning the platform herself. She was honest with me about that, by the way, and simply asked me a lot of questions and took the opportunity to learn from me. And that was smart. But then she realized I had questions she couldn't answer, and so she started looking for opportunities to schedule a meeting with Cecil. So he came on camera, this is on Zoom, and even though this was just a year ago, I never knew at the time he was suffering from ALS because he wasn't presenting in a way that was obvious on camera. And he immediately struck up a conversation with me about all those books that you can see behind me. That is a good sales tactic, by the way. If you can tell someone loves something, and my family does love books and does love Legos, you can immediately build rapport talking about what they love. But this opened me up to feel comfortable as Cecil started asking me lots of questions about why I was leaving the other survey platform. And he asked me about the work we do in healthcare and the work we do for all of you in the OPO world. He told me about his desire to see Question Pro doing more healthcare work because it was something he felt they would be good at in helping providers to serve patients better. And little did I know, he was dealing with so much of that firsthand. But the moment I remember most is when he asked me what we were paying for our other platform. Now, this is when you're getting a bid from a vendor, this is something you don't tell. Okay, it takes away all of your leverage. But I felt enough trust in this conversation to share the actual number. And I remember that he laughed and he said, "Sean, we're going to save you some money." And that, music to my ears, right? But you know what? I only shared that number because I trusted by then that they actually would care to save me money. Because you know what? Many salespeople would try to match or evenly slightly exceed the amount that I was paying elsewhere. And I was actually even getting a bargain price from that other platform due to being a longtime client. So if he had known that, he probably could have even asked me for that, and I still would have been getting a bargain, right? But Cecil understood as we talked that I did need to save some money because I'd already explained. It was a tough year, and we were struggling to hang on. He wasn't worried about what he and his team could gain because we weren't talking transactionally, nor was he trying to diagnose my problems and tell me how his platform could fix my problems with his features. That was, by the way, another experience I'd had with this competitor. He kept things relational. But by the time we got to talking about the platform, our call was already nearly over. And I asked a few questions I had about the platform. They all got answered quickly. But it didn't matter because I had already made my choice. All I had to do was persuade the rest of my team that Question Pro was the one we wanted to go with. And you know what? They all agreed. We felt heard. We felt like we mattered. We felt like if we had a problem, these folks would help us fix it. So here's some more from Cecil, this time about the power of listening when you're a leader.
Listening also plays a powerful role inside of teams. Earlier in my career, I learned this lesson the hard way as a leader. When someone on my team came to me with a problem, my instinct was to solve it immediately. It was only natural. I was already good at the job that they were doing. And honestly, I just wanted to help. And I thought that was my job. To provide direction, provide coaching, provide answers. But I eventually realized something. When I moved too quickly into advice and solution mode, people stopped sharing the full story. They began editing what they told me. They protected themselves. The moment I slowed down and focused on understanding first, everything changed. People opened up. They shared what they were actually struggling with. Coaching landed differently because it came from partnership rather than evaluation. Great leaders do not rush to answers. They create space where their teams feel comfortable thinking out loud.
So remember, Cecil spoke earlier about how listening to solve people's problems is a natural instinct, especially when we're in charge. We who are in positions of leadership feel accountable to provide direction, coaching, advice, and next steps. This is very common throughout the OPO community. I see it all the time, and it's a good impulse. But you know what? When we take the time to listen, we can often get folks to be comfortable enough to tell us what the real problems are. Sometimes they don't even know when they come to us. You know what? So many of our solutions at RPG have come from me just listening to our team members speak, hearing what they're really struggling with, and then working to find a solution that's collaborative rather than handed down from on high. We can all strive to be better listeners as leaders, and I know I try to do it every day. Here's a little bit more from Cecil, this time a little bit more personal.
The idea matters even more in our personal lives. One of the most powerful lessons I've learned about listening comes from my relationship with my wife, Grace. There have been many moments over the past year where life has been incredibly heavy for both of us. ALS changes the way you think about the future. It changes how you experience time. And in those moments, I've learned something really important. Sometimes the most powerful thing we could offer someone, sometimes the most powerful thing we could offer someone we love is not advice, it's presence. Just sitting together, just listening, just acknowledging that something is hard. And now, when I look at our baby girl, Lizzie, I think about the same thing. The way we listen to the people we love shapes how safe they feel sharing their lives with us. Listening is not just a business skill, it's one of the most human things we could do for each other.
So, before I got married, every girlfriend I ever had described me as being too dominating and always assuming that my way was the best way. So, one of the best pieces of advice I'd ever been given in my own marriage is to avoid my desire to solve my wife's problems and to just listen and let her talk when she needs to share something. It's hard sometimes because she loves to talk and I love to solve problems, but I make a point of trying to listen without speaking unless I need to, even if it means busying my hands with other tasks so I can devote my mental attention her way. As a result, when I do offer a solution, it feels less to both of us like I'm trying to be in charge and more like it's a solution that comes from our mutual love and respect for one another. And we've made it over 20 years, so we're doing something right. I personally cannot imagine what Cecil is going through with ALS. And I know that no matter how positive and optimistic he is and how much he truly lives as if every day is like Christmas, and believe me, he does, that he and his wife have been tested and challenged incredibly since I met him a year ago. And yet, he still understands and models what we all know to be true, that in hard times, we gain so much more from listening to one another than we can endure, or so we can endure the difficulty together. There's one more part of Cecil's article I'd like to share, and it goes back to where we started. Remember, he was in the ER recently. He was suffering from incredible pain and dehydration, and he'd just experienced a person in the ER who moved him to a bed in a manner that didn't regard his feelings of pain or his frustration as a patient. They got the right result, but in the wrong way. So here's the rest of the story. What happened next, still in that same ER, was the opposite. The nurses needed to draw blood. My body was dehydrated and resisting. They tried once, then again, then a third time. I was howling. I was exhausted and scared and in serious pain. And through every attempt, they stopped. They apologized, genuinely, not reflexively. They acknowledged that what I was going through without minimizing it or rushing past it to get to the next clinical step. They stayed with me in the difficulty. They named it. They kept trying because they had to, but they never once made me feel like my pain was an inconvenience to their process. That is optimism without spin. That is presence over performance. Validation before resolution. Not as a concept, but as a human being sitting at the edge of a hospital bed at the end of a terrible day, choosing to acknowledge rather than dismiss. They were not just performing a task well, they were making listening visible. The next set of moments came after I was admitted for overnight observation. The nurses checked on me every 2 hours. Every single time, someone asked how I was doing and waited for the answer. Not a checkbox, not a protocol, a genuine pause for a real response. It sounds simple. In a system under pressure, it's anything but. And then our palliative care doctor came in. He didn't stand in the doorway. He didn't glance at his watch. He sat down, truly sat down, and asked us what was going on. Not clinically. He already had the chart. He wanted to know what we were actually experiencing, what we were scared of, what we needed. He stayed with us for an hour. He didn't fix everything, but by the time he left, the room felt different. We felt like partners in our own care, not passengers in someone else's process. 2 days, 4 interactions, same hospital, the full spectrum of what listening looks like and what its absence costs. Well, I hope you've enjoyed hearing from my friend Cecil, and I'll include his contact information in the show notes because he's very genuine, and I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you if you have any questions or thoughts you'd like to share. I want to close by letting Cecil's words from the video I've been clipping serve as the final word on listening.
So listening produces very measurable outcomes. Customers who feel heard, they decide faster. They negotiate less aggressively. They stay longer. And they advocate more strongly. So listening becomes a competitive advantage. When people feel respected and understood, decisions stop feeling risky. Our goal is not to persuade. Our goal is not persuasion. Our goal is clarity. And listening creates that clarity. And clarity makes decisions easier. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned for the next installment of this series, I Felt Heard. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for listening to OPO Insights. We'll be back next week with more great interviews from OPO professionals. I'm Sean from RPG, and we will see you next time.